When you look at their climate financing needs, we're talking about $23 trillion, and the majority of that financing needs to come from the private sector. I'm Dr. Hubert Danso. I'm the CEO and Chairman of Africa Investor, an institutional infrastructure investment company. I also chair the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, and I also chair the African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Leaders Forum. I'm also a member of President Macron's Finance and Private Sector Task Force for this new Financial Pact Summit. And as a consequence, we work very closely with key leading global asset owner platforms, the net zero asset owner being one of the most prominent. When you look at their climate financing needs, we're talking about $23 trillion according to the latest data. And the majority of that financing needs to come from the private sector. It needs to be private capital, which is distinct from other markets in the world. So there needs to be a wholesale shift in the way that the multilateral development banks catalyze that financing. I think the MDBs have not really been able to mobilize private capital at scale, particularly for emerging markets in developing countries, but optimize the balance sheets to crowd in private capital at scale. They've got to be able to subordinate and de-risk the participation of long-term institutional capital. There's got to be a much better alignment and a much stricter focus around the nationally determined contribution projects, the projects that the governments have said, these are our priority projects that need private capital. MDB should really focus on helping to de-risk private capital's participation in those particular transactions, as opposed to just seeking to provide their own instruments, which in some cases are in direct conflict or competition with what we could do as the private sector. I mean, it's unprecedented that we now have to mobilize these tens of trillions of dollars, all sort of within a 7 to 10 year period. So I think we need to redefine and really help the multilateral development banks understand exactly what we need to be able to deploy capital at scale and ensure that there's a legal and regulatory environment in the markets that we participate that can absorb and grow this capital at speed. So it's a collective effort, it's a collaboration, and I think, really being able to share our collective knowledge and our operating models, and in many cases, create new operating models. And that's really what we've done through the institutional investor public partnership framework. We've moved essentially from a transactional model, which is much more blended finance oriented, to an at-scale and an at-speed model, which is now defined as blended investment. It's much more programmatic. I mean, we set out 6 key things in the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance paper that are really going to help transform the private capital mobilization capacity of the multilateral development banks, the development finance institutions, and the international financial institutions. That essentially was a big focus on, improving the governance, improving the need and the ability to have collective action. Also looking at the better use and mainstreaming of risk-related data. The use of more guarantees. These were a number of the things that really came out as, really impactful aspects that we can actually use to crowd in more private capital at scale to align with the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, particularly in emerging markets and developing countries, but on a global basis. One of the key things that I think that we need to really focus on, not only leadership from us as the asset owner communities, but we need a new direct partner. And that direct partner needs to be heads of state. We've had a massive summit here today, the new Financial Pact Summit, bringing together $1.5 trillion, and every head of state made it here. That's really influential in this discussion. But we, as an asset owner community, represent 150 to 200 trillion, and we have not had that summit yet where the heads of state have really called on us and we've begun to work with them on this scale. So we continue to call to address the inequalities of the private capital mobilization agenda and to really enfranchise and help emerging markets and developing countries realize their development as well as commercial potential, which is an investment opportunity for us. In the past, the development partners were the ones that would really be calling on asset owners to help develop solutions, particularly for emerging markets, developing countries, climate and sustainable development goals. But if you look at the record of private capital mobilization from development partners, the metric is very clear. For every $1 of MDB finance, multilateral development bank finance, they're supposed to bring in $10 of private capital. Their actual performance, according to the G20, has been that for every $1 of MDB finance provided, they've only been able to mobilize 20 cents or 38 cents. So they are effectively not the constituency. So really, in terms of developing and designing the types of new products, that is something that we would really need to do by ourselves, and then call on the MDBs and the concessional finance and the philanthropy market, the philanthropies, to come in with a more blended solution. And we think doing that at scale is taking blended finance into this new big at-scale programmatic format called blended investment. And we believe that blended investment is the future, and it needs to be led by us as asset owners in terms of a design, so it's aligned with our mandates, our investment policy statements, and our risk-adjusted return expectations, and then we can really have the impact that we need, working closely with governments, but also working closely with multilateral development banks to provide that blended investment piece. There was a piece of research that we launched just yesterday at the Macron Summit, which showed that emerging markets and developing countries are probably paying, anywhere between $15 billion per annum in excess interest payments on their loan, and probably far more than that in lost opportunities because the GEMS database has not been opened up. The Global Emerging Markets database is one of probably the best risk-related database, bringing together all of the performance of the loans held in the portfolios of multilateral development banks. But unfortunately, that particular database for the last 10 years has not been made available to the critical users, us, as the risk takers. So there are two things that are happening. As a consequence of our constant calls and this new data that's come to market about the cost to emerging markets and developing countries, there is some movement. The summit has now agreed to advance a program called GEMS 2.0, and we're saying that GEMS 2.0 needs to be done by the end of this year, by the end of 2023. They were asking by the end of 2024. We said, the cost to the governments is just unconscionable and they need to accelerate that, and we hope that that's going to happen. But we think just opening the database, it only goes halfway there. What we really want is to be able to have this database be expanded with new data, with inputs from us as the institutional investment community, as the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, and also input from the credit rating agencies. And this is a platform that we're calling GEMS 3.0. And GEMS 3.0 transforms this particular GEMS data in the form of GEMS 2.0 into an asset allocation tool. So it not only gives us sight of the data or access to the data, but enables us to feed into the process so that it can be an asset allocation tool that we can then begin to work together to say, how can we collectively think about responsibly de-risking our allocations and financings to these markets in line with the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. So we are very hopeful that that's actually going to be the case. It's one of the recommendations that was taken on by President Macron and the heads of state. GEMS 3.0 is going to be a very critical platform for net zero asset owner members to really contribute and drive that particular initiative. The Africa-Europe Energy Earthshot hosted an event with us as Africa Investor yesterday, and it really focused on how do you unlock and make Africa's industrial green energy potential investable. And what type of plan is required to accomplish that. Probably 5 or 10 years ago, that plan would have been something developed by multilateral development banks, but now we are really talking about how do you mobilize private capital at scale. So we came together really to send a very clear message that if you really want to attract private capital at scale, you really need to have a plan that is a wholesale private capital mobilization program. And we had 2 examples of that. We think that the Inflation Reduction Act is a wholesale private capital mobilization program being used successfully to attract capital by the United States of America. There is a very similar plan called the EU Green Deal and the EU Green Industrialization Plan, which is similar to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is used to basically send the right market signal and create the right policy conditions to attract institutional capital at scale for Europe's industrialization. So the event yesterday was really focusing on Africa's version of that plan that could really talk to the needs and the opportunities and the risk appetites of global and domestic institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, to really be able to have a whole system change. The continent has about 30 to 40% of the key critical minerals for green technologies that are going to be essential as a globe to get to net zero. By the end of the century, we're going to have over 50% of the world's workforce in terms of our youth bulge. And then when you look at our natural capital, our sun, our wind, our hydro, we have 5 times more exajoules than Europe and America combined. So all of that abundant renewable energy that can decarbonize industry is essentially going to position Africa as the next green technologies manufacturing hub. So this new plan is really designed to enable and offer asset owners the opportunity to participate in all of the commercial and the investment upside of that particular opportunity. So it's a whole systems shift. It's basically putting real long-term money behind a really long-term good investment opportunity that will not only decarbonize Africa, but will also decarbonize the globe as a consequence. The event on Africa was a really good opportunity to announce and launch the Just Transition Investors Alliance, which is an alliance of institutional investors that have come together to invest in green industrial cities in Africa so that we can actually help beneficiate critical minerals for the just transition and the key green technologies. We entered into a partnership with United Cities, a big UN program that's developing cities to really bring new technologies, new manufacturing, new industrial opportunities for the benefit of Africa to be able to increase its industrialization trajectory and also borrow and sort of bring in new technologies from the rest of the world and then service the $10 trillion and growing global green industrial economy. The work starting today really is going to be dependent on leadership from the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance as the only UN-convened group, legitimate group of global institutional asset owners. There is a roadmap of activities that are coming out of this summit here in Paris. President Ruto of Kenya is hosting the African Climate Action Summit, where President Macron and a number of the heads of state that have been here from around the world will participate in that. From there, we go to the G20. From there, we then go to the UN General Assembly in September, looking at the SDG review, and we go to COP28. And at each of these intervals, the role and expectation of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and the institutional investment community occupying this new leadership role to drive private capital mobilization at scale is really going to grow. But we're very, very confident because we've been asking for this opportunity for a very long time. So I'm very glad that this summit has afforded us that. I am optimistic that the message has landed. Governments, multilateral development banks, civil society have all understood that there is absolutely no pathway to net zero without the exponential increase of allocations from institutional investors like us. So that realization means that we now have a seat at the table, and I think that's really what makes me optimistic. But it means that our leadership role needs to be much more pronounced. We actually have to lead as opposed to follow. And I think that institutional investor-public partnerships are going to be the framework within which we can help design products. We can orient collective action so that concessional money can take the risks that we can't. It can do the capacity building. It can help develop the bankable pipeline of investable projects and products. And I think the work now starts. The summit was a good pretext, but the work now starts. We have a leadership role, and I think if we take this opportunity, we will be the difference between the world decarbonizing or not.